you are not looking closely enough. Evil is not always about who you are. Harm does not only come from active cruelty, it can also come from the quiet decision to wait. The most dangerous form of evil is not a dramatic or theatrical one. Power did not implement cruelty. It amplified what was already possible. The most dangerous parts of human behavior are the ones we're convinced don't apply to us. I have been working on this episode for weeks, and what I realized is this: I can give you every historical example, every psychological framework that explain how ordinary people commit extraordinary harm. But if it stays theoretical, if it feels like it belongs to someone else, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't hit the way I need this episode to. I recently watched a show called The Beast in Me on Netflix, and the title alone, The Beast in Me, captured what I've been circling around without fully naming. The episode is not about monsters, and this isn't about the villains we can label and push far away. It's about recognizing that the same psychological patterns in them exist in us. If this does not make you uncomfortable, you are not looking closely enough. And if this does not feel like it applies to you, then you're exactly who I'm talking to. When people hear the word evil, they reach for something diagnostic, because diagnosis creates distance. The word psychopath, equally convenient. We talked about this in the last episode, actually. Psychopathy is very real. It is studied extensively. It includes traits like diminished empathy, shallow affect, impulsivity, manipulativeness, and lack of remorse. But true psychopathy is rare, which means most harm in this world is not caused by individuals who meet the criteria for psychopathy. Let's be honest. Wars are not the work of small groups of psychopaths. Atrocities are not carried out by a handful of people who are simply wired wrong. And violence inside families cannot be dismissed as a simple, rare mental disorder. No. In fact, most harm is carried out by people who believe they're justified. Let's rehear that. Justified. People who love their families. People who see themselves as rational and as actors in a morally complex world. Once you remove psychopathy as your primary explanation, you are left with something far more unsettling. Ordinary psychology under pressure. Ordinary people under pressure. This is where nature versus nurture becomes very relevant, but not in the simplistic way we're often presented in schools. No, biology matters. Temperament varies. Fear response varies. Impulse control even varies. Some people are more reactive. Some people are more sensation-seeking. Some are less naturally attuned to others' emotions. But neuroscience has shown us that the developing brain is shaped by the environment that we're in. When someone grows up under constant stress, their brain adapts to survive it. Trauma can make them more reactive and less able to slow down their impulses. We know somebody like that, huh? Neglect can make it harder to trust, bond, or feel secure even. Sure, you might be born with certain traits, a predisposition, if you will, but life experiences decide how those traits play out. That interaction is exactly why the case of Mary Bell remains psychologically significant. So Mary Bell was only 11 years old when she killed another child. Honestly, she was just a child herself. In December 1968, she was tried as an adult in court and convicted of manslaughter, but not murder. Instead of having a fixed sentence, the court ordered detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. So this was obviously not tried in the US, which meant she would be held and reviewed over time based on her development and rehabilitation, which honestly seems fair considering the court knew that she knew right from wrong. She recognized that, but it also recognized something else. She grew up in severe neglect and abuse. There was documented physical violence in her household. There was even documented sexual exploitation by her own mother. She was raised in instability during the years when empathy, impulse control, moral judgment, they're all still developing in this child. Now, this doesn't excuse what she did, no, but it forces you to look at the full picture, doesn't it? Let's talk about the fact that because when biology and environment collide during childhood, the outcome is rarely simple. And that is exactly why the question of where evil comes from is far more complicated than we want it to be. This is, again, This doesn't excuse her actions, and it shouldn't, but it complicates the narrative that evil is either inborn or entirely voluntary. Nature versus nurture, fight or flight response. Her case forces us to hold two realities at once. A child committed horrific harm, and that child's development unfolded inside sustained trauma. Nature and nurture are not opposing forces. They're not. They interact, and sometimes that interaction produces outcomes that challenge our need for moral simplicity. Sit with that for a minute, because this doesn't stop at childhood. When you look at how ordinary adults behave under social pressure, the picture becomes even more unsettling. I'm sure we've all studied or heard of the 1960s psychologist Stanley Milgram, who ran a series of experiments to see how far ordinary people would go when told to obey authority. Participants believed they were taking part in a study on learning. They were instructed to deliver electric shocks to another person whenever that person answered a question incorrectly. As the shocks increased, the person on the other side, who they can't see and was actually an actor, began to protest. He complained about the pain, the actor. He was asked to stop. Eventually, he fell silent. The participants seemed uncomfortable. They hesitated. They questioned what was happening. Some were even visibly anxious. But when the researcher told them the experiment required them to continue, guess what happened? Most of them continued. They believed they were genuinely delivering increasingly severe, even potentially lethal shocks. Milgram did not uncover a room full of hidden psychopaths. He uncovered something far more, as we like to say, unsettling. Ordinary people will often hand over their moral responsibility to authority if the structure makes it feel legitimate. I'm sure we can all think of other ideas or case studies about this. So they did not see themselves as evil. That's what you have to understand. They saw themselves as following instructions in a controlled setting. Obedience changed how they understood their own actions. And that is what makes that study so disturbing. Similarly, in the Stanford prison experiment, psychologist Philip Zimbardo, hope I said his name right, took a group of, again, ordinary college kids and randomly assigned them roles in a fake prison. Some were labeled guards, others were labeled prisoners. It wasn't based on personality. No one was chosen because they were more aggressive or more unstable. They were just average college students. Please remember that. The environment was staged to feel real, but wasn't. The guards were given authority. The prisoners were given numbers instead of names. Within days, the dynamic shifted. The guards began enforcing rules quite harshly. They humiliated the fake prisoners. They used punishment and intimidation. The prisoners became withdrawn, anxious, and emotionally distressed. Some showed even signs of a breakdown. These were ordinary people who knew that this was staged. Please keep all of this in mind. The situation escalated so quickly that the study had to be stopped early. The point wasn't that these students were secretly cruel or secretly psychopaths. It was that the role, the power imbalance, and the environment changed how they behaved. When you give ordinary people unchecked authority and remove accountability, behavior can shift very fast. And that is the part we avoid, because it suggests that evil is not always about who you are, but about what situation you're placed into. This wasn't proof that they were monsters. It was proof that the situation changed them. Power, role, expectations, and lack of accountability really altered that behavior. The beast in all of us. Power did not implement cruelty. It amplified what was already possible. These mechanisms, they're not confined to laboratories or to studies. Let's think about something we've probably all we've all been through. Think about road rage. Someone who sees themselves as a calm and reasonable gets cut off in traffic. In a split second, their heart starts racing. They feel disrespected, maybe even threatened. That anger builds up real fast. What happens next feels justified. In that moment, they yell, they tailgate, maybe they even get out of the car. From the outside, it looks like irrational, but inside, that moment, it feels deserved. That shift is small, but powerful. A simple mistake becomes a personal attack on that person. that feeling becomes a reason to escalate, and suddenly aggression feels necessary. Let's look at that word again. Necessary, like justified. They didn't wake up that morning planning to hurt anyone, but that story changed in real life. Something so simple. Road rage. Let's talk about inaction. The same dynamics apply. There was a case in Queens, New York that later inspired research on something called the bystander effect, where multiple witnesses heard a woman, screaming about an attack. Yet, intervention was unfortunately delayed because each person assumed somebody else would step in. Responsibility doesn't disappear. It just spread out. And when responsibility spreads out, it starts to feel lighter on that person. That psychological shift is called diffusion of responsibility. In that moment, doing nothing does not register as evil. It just feels reasonable, right? The other guy will call the police. It feels cautious. It feels like avoiding involvement in something that may not even be your place to intervene, right? And that is what makes it so powerful. Harm does not only come from active cruelty, it can also come from the quiet decision to wait, to look away, to assume someone else will handle it. When you trace the pattern from obedience to power to justification to inaction, you begin to see that evil is not always so explosive or so dramatic. Often it is procedural, gradual, rationalized, justified. And that is where the word law enters the picture. But please understand that law does not define evil. It defines crime. It determines what is punishable, what meets statutory thresholds, and what falls under categories like perversion or misconduct. Evil, however, is actually not a legal term. It is a moral and psychological one. It is shaped by intention, context, relationships, and internal reasoning. Please understand that the legal system was able to account for development in the case of, like, Mary Bell. It could distinguish murder from manslaughter, right? It could be considered a diminished responsibility. But even there, it was a defining criminal liability, but not the evil itself. And that leaves us with a difficult question. If evil is shaped by psychology, context, and intention, how could the law ever meaningfully define it? Why is it easier for the law to define sexual misconduct than to define cruelty or abuse of power? What would justice look like if it actually considered the psychology behind the harm, not just whether the law was broken? This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about removing the comfort, about thinking about this only applies to other people, to someone else. I really want you to think about it. Think for yourself. Question everything. The most dangerous form of evil is not a dramatic or theatrical one. It is the version that feels justified, reasonable, and aligned with one's own narrative. If, again, you believe this discussion does not apply to you, that belief deserves examination. If it does not make you uncomfortable, you are not looking closely enough. And before you distance yourself from people you label as evil, ask yourself, what would it take for you to cross that line? And are we really as far away as we think we are from it? Because you decide evil belongs to someone else. Ask yourself honestly, what would have to change in your fear, your loyalty, your environment for you to justify harm? And you are absolutely certain that these conditions could never exist for you? Are you sure? This is underneath it all, the evil in all of us.